at first, the first thing when you were talking about the imagination, I was saying, we're speaking about an individual thing, but can you tell us what you mean by it being a collective, like the imagination being a collective of people, or like maybe how people can share a collective imagination?
Yeah, sure. I'll speak about it in general terms, and then I'll maybe speak a little bit about it in terms of social movements. This idea of the collective imagination is one that we pick up from the Greek and French philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis, who was active from the 1950s right until the 1990s. And he actually thinks that almost all of social reality is made up of the imagination. He talks about the imagination as a force like magma, like lava from a volcano that is like a liquid, which then solidifies into a shape, and then at the next eruption, it turns back into a liquid. And if you think about an institution like marriage, for instance, we know from the anthropological record that human civilizations have practiced many, many different forms of marriage over the centuries. Some marriage involved many, many people. Some marriages just involved two. Some marriages are heterosexual. Some marriages are homosexual or sexual in a multitude of different ways. Some marriages are non-sexual. And what this tells us is that the idea of marriage, as important as it is to many of our lives and to our society, is actually a kind of solidification of the imagination. The value we associate with marriage and what we understand marriage to be is this sort of temporary solidification of our collective imagination as a society around a specific form or around a specific mode or shape. So this gives us a sense, and we can extend this to other institutions as well. I mean, the police, for instance, are a social institution that is only really about 150 years old. Didn't really exist in the modern form of, people wearing blue who have the license to shoot you or arrest you until, the 19th century. And so the idea that certain people in our society would be allowed to be armed, that they would be allowed to arrest people, that they would have certain rights and powers that are over top of everyone else, that's, of course, very material. It's something that exists in the real world, of course, these people exist. But on the other hand, the value and the power we attribute to these humans because they get given a badge is an act of the collective imagination, and often with very dangerous effects. So social movements in some ways, I was
going to say, I think that's important because we want everybody to remember, even though we're having a conversation about philosophy in general, it does actually have a real effect on everyday lives. It's actually pertinent to everyday issues that we're out here battling. But keep going. I just wanted to make that comment in there.
Well, I think exactly. And I think this is what social movements recognize in some fundamental sense. Whether they use this terminology or not. I mean, I think that the thing that most social movements grapple with all the time, the thing I hear again and again, whether I'm interviewing activists or whether I'm active in social movements myself, is this idea that we need to transform people's minds. We need to raise consciousness, or we need to transform people's perception of the world, because most people don't even recognize that the things that are the problems that we're trying to deal with are in fact problems. They don't know, for instance, about the control of the mass media by a few corporations. They maybe don't realize about the depth of the economic injustices or the racial injustices or the gender injustices. So we're always trying to transform people's imaginations and let them see or help one another realize that the world is, that there are these forces in the world that we need to address, and that the world can actually be different. And I think the radical imagination is the ability to say, actually, if all social institutions, if society at large is made up of this kind of solidification of the imagination, of the collective imagination, then it doesn't need to be this way. Nothing needs to be this way. The economy doesn't need to work this way. The police don't need to work this way. Marriage doesn't need to work this way. All of those institutions can be transformed if enough of us get together, if we make a demand, and if we set into motion certain types of collective power that could actually transform society. And that's an act of the radical imagination. And that's something that social movements are always trying to do. And if we look at any social movement throughout history, at least a part of their strategy and a part of their actions have been about transforming people's perceptions and working together to try and build a collective sense of what exists in the world now and what is possible as well.